Here are the exercises for Chapter 10 on functions. The only exercises we're going to do in this chapter are work on the course project. So, you'll recall that in the course project we currently have just one great big function called main. That's not standard when you're developing large systems. It's bad practice to simply have a main and that's all in a large system. You would typically break that up into smaller and smaller chunks. So, here are the chunks that I want you to break it up into. I want to create a function called output that displays the details of one CD. You will need to pass in the details of that particular CD. In other words, you'll need to pass in the artist and the title and the number of tracks and whether it's an album or a single and the price. You'll have to pass in all of those things and then you'll have to display them accordingly. Shouldn't be too difficult. Now I'd like you to create a function that is called enter. It takes one parameter, a string, and the function will display that string on the keyboard and then wait for the user to press enter. In other words, it's just going to be like a printf and a flush and a getchar, and that's about it. But that's the sort of thing we're probably going to need to do from time to time, so it may be useful for us to create a function to do it. This will be a reusable function. Anyway, it'll take one parameter, which is the string that you wish the user to see before they press enter. So, for example, if you wanted the user to see, please press enter to exit the program, then the string, please press enter to exit the program, would be the single function parameter. Okay, let's move on. Now, similar to the enter function, I'd like another function called yes/no. Again, it takes one string parameter, which is essentially the question that you're about to ask the user, and then it reads a character from the keyboard until that character is a yes or a no. Now, here's the clever part. Then, it's actually going to return a 1 or a 0 back to the calling function based on whatever character the user typed in. So, if they type in a Y, up or a lowercase, then the function will return a value of 1. If they type in an N, upper or lowercase, the function will return a value of 0. And if they type in anything else, then it should display some kind of error message and repeat the question until they get it right. Now, when you've written this function, you might like to revisit the area of the code where you enter the user, where you ask the user to enter whether it's an album or a single. You might like to rephrase that as a yes/no question. You might like to ask the question, is the CD an album? Yes or no? And they will answer yes or no, and you'll return a 1 or a 0. In other words, you'll be returning a Boolean value. This will be a Boolean function. It'll still be returning an integer. I mean, the function type will be integer, but the values that you return will be 0 or 1. Therefore, you can class this function as a Boolean function. So anyway, once you've written it, once you've written yes/no, you might like to revisit the code where you input the album or single details and change it so that it uses the new yes/no function, and see if you can find any other parts of the code where you ask yes/no questions and change them to use it as well. Okay, moving on. Similar to yes/no, I'd like you to create 3 more functions: readInt, readFloat, and readString, that all do essentially exactly the same thing. They ask the user a question, and that question will be passed in to the function as a parameter, and then they, in the case of readInt and readFloat, the return value for that function will be the integer that got read in from the keyboard, from the user. Now, I need to teach you one more thing before you can actually do the final one of these functions, the readString function. I haven't told you this before, but it is not possible for a function to return an array as its return type. In other words, you can't return a string. Now, that's kind of not strictly true. I mean, it is true when we'll know that. We'll know more about that when we get up to function pointers and up to advanced pointers. But for now, I think it's just good enough to know that you can't return strings from functions. The flip side of that is that, remember how I said to you, cast your mind back to the function called doubleIt, where I passed in an integer and I wanted the function to double the integer. And I said it was a one-way street. you could never get a function to modify its parameter and have that parameter, the modified version of that parameter, find its way back to the original function. Remember that? In other words, functions cannot modify their parameters. I mean, the function can modify the parameter, but that modified value will never escape from the function. As soon as the function is closed and finished, the modified value disappears forever because it's a copy. Well, I'm here to tell you now that for arrays, any kind of array, and in particular strings, it's different. The function can certainly modify the elements of the array. You can modify each of the individual elements. In other words, you can create a read string function and pass it as a parameter the string that you want it to read, and it can fill in that string for you. That's very, very handy to do that. Now, as to why arrays and strings are different to all other types of variables, well, you'll learn about that when we get up to pointers, which is a couple of chapters away yet. But for now, it's enough information for you to know that a function can modify its parameter if that parameter is an array, including strings. So, that should give you enough information to create a read string function. Notice this read string function will not have a return statement in it. It will simply modify the parameter. Okay, I hope that's enough information for you to go on with. Create a function, a very simple function, to trim the new line character from a string, if there is one. So you probably should check if there is a new line character, and if there is, remove it. You can probably make the assumption that if there is a new line character, that it is the last character in the string, apart from the null terminating character. I don't mean the final character in the array, I mean the last character on the string before the null. Okay, so trim the new line, and then use that trimming function where appropriate, in other words, for the artist and for the title of the CD. Finally, put a prototype for each of these new functions in the header file. Obviously don't create a prototype for main. You never need a prototype for main. Okay, so we're doing some quite wholesale changes to our course project. Let's see how you go.